All right, guys. So your sit rep day, well, June 22nd, 2025. So I believe it was yesterday that the Americans uh, bombed Natanz, Isfahan, and of course Ferdow nuclear facilities. There's been some, I mean, Trump announced that their beautiful planes launched their beautiful weapons and like nothing before, no one else in the world could ever have done it, and it was phenomenal and so on. In terms of Western battle damage assessments, they assessed that it was a complete success, of course. The Iranians haven't said too much. I've seen reports of explosions, I've seen reports of damage. Overall, what I've heard from Iran sources, which you may have heard too, is that it was not unanticipated. It was not an unanticipated amount of damage. I was very curious going in. I spent the week from the 13th to the 20th, 21st, looking into this issue of the B-2 bomber and whether Iran's air defense could detect this B-2 stealth bomber and whether the Ferdow facility could withstand the bunker buster 30,000-ton GBU-57. So I'm sure a lot of you did the same thing, trying to study these weapons that the Americans have and how fantastical they would be. And as I was making that study, I realized this is not what this is about. The nuclear, Iran's nuclear program is merely a pretext. The agenda for Iran is the same as the agenda for Yemen. It's the same as the agenda for Syria. It's the same as the agenda for Lebanon. The sole issue is getting these states to bend the knee or be destroyed, or both. Syria bent the knee and was destroyed. Syria was regime changed, the new regime bent the knee, and they're in the process of being destroyed. Anyway, so that is what they want for Iran. They want Iran to be destroyed as a state. They want to install a puppet, and then they want to be able to bomb that puppet. They want chaos. They want the destruction of states that could conceivably oppose them. Iraq was destroyed. Syria was destroyed. Lebanon is maintained in the sectarian way. And the resistance that arose during the occupation of Lebanon and turned into this formidable force, Hezbollah, is now expected to be policed by the rest of the state and the rest of the communities in this sectarian space. Jordan is pacified. Egypt is pacified. Egypt, I don't know if you saw the reports, but Israelis are allowed to go through Egypt. So Israelis who can't leave the country through their airport, who are not liking getting bombed by Iran, they expect to do the bombing, not to get bombed. And they are horrified by the fact that Iran can bomb them back, which is a big part of why they wanted to go to war with Iran, and they hoped that their terrorist methods of using quadcopters and drones and assassinations of the leadership and anti-tank guided missiles and all these various attacks, simultaneous attacks, all on the first day was going to lead to the collapse of the state. And then I guess they were hoping that these cells could maintain a tempo of destructive operations against the state to create kind of chaos, tension that would lead to collapse, psychological collapse of the leadership and the state. And what happened in this week in terms of Iranian domestic politics, and many Iranian sources have reported this with pleasant surprise, is that Iran's divisions, which are every society has divisions, but there's a revolution that happened in 1979. And in that revolution, there were a lot of different politics. There were communists, there were liberals, and there were more religious movements. And ultimately, including, with some suppression that happens in struggles for power. The religious elements won over the others and ultimately crushed their domestic enemies. Um, and so those kinds of resentments often become the basis for imperialists to work. That becomes the space, right, to get in there and work with the liberals and work with disaffected monarchists, terrorists in the case of the MEK, and to ultimately, and Kurdish minorities, Baloch minority communities that might have grievances against the majority or not, but you can always, as imperialists, that is what they do. That's how the Americans, the Anglos, get in there in Asia, elsewhere. That's what they do. So every country has these things that can be exploited. And of course, the Anglo-Zionist imperialists hoped that that would happen after their terrorist attack on the 13th, but it really didn't. On the contrary, faced with the bombing, the destruction of their state, and the indiscriminate attacks on civilians and children, the usual things the Israelis do, bombing hospitals, ambulances, schools, the Iranian people, from different political tendencies, they said, no, this is a matter of our independence and our sovereignty, and we want to fight. And you may have seen some of these videos of liberal women, making very patriotic statements that they didn't want to. They don't want to capitulate to Israel. On the contrary, so they have a lot of fighting spirit and a lot of patriotism. And so Iran recovered militarily, like we said, 10 out within about 10 to 12 hours on the 13th, and began to do multiple strikes every single day that have been hitting their targets in Israel and hitting them and creating scenes of devastation. Within a few days, the Israelis decided to censor those. So the first few days you started to see real devastation, and then you stopped because the communications minister in Israel said, no more communications, please. And so for the past few days, I don't know, I think it's been 8 days, for the past 4 days, I think, of the 8, there hasn't been too much in the way of scenes of devastation. There's been some, but not very much. And so that buildup over the Thursday, Friday, we started to see the military buildup that the US does. And I mentioned this on Twitter. I said that the Americans have always, if you look at World War I, World War II, Panama, Grenada, Iraq 1990, Iraq 2003, Americans take their time when they're doing a military buildup because they've never had to rush. They can take all the time in the world to gather their troops because nobody ever attacks them while they're gathering their troops. And this was no exception. People were watching the B-2s get set up on bases in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Diego Garcia, which is in the Indian Ocean. All of these American bases in these parts of the world where there's no business having these European colonists, and yet, treated as if they're sovereign American territory. So the Americans were moving all these assets into place, and there was satellite imagery. And people asked me, why don't they preemptively attack? And they asked me the same in the lead up to the 13th. And Iran doesn't do that. Iran doesn't do that. So I just kind of wanted to say this, like, there's not much point in talking about what Iran should do. And someone said this in a funny way on Twitter. They said there's a genre of Twitter called "If I Ran Iran," which I thought was pretty clever. If I ran Iran, if I ran Iran, here's what I would do. I would assassinate Israelis. I would bomb civilians. I would launch all 5,000 missiles at once. I would do this, and so there's a if I ran Iran, I wouldn't be deceived by negotiations. And I guess my reaction to that is, you know, I hate to quote Donald Rumsfeld, um, who, for those of you who are young, and I know most of you are not, but for those of you who are, Donald Rumsfeld was the Secretary of State, I think, for George W. Bush during the Iraq 2003 invasion, and he was frequently in front of the cameras saying all kinds of um all kinds of brazenly imperialist things. He's clearly an intelligent person, um, but an intelligent imperialist, an architect of imperialism, I would say, and of war, um, and a long-term strategist of the American empire. And he's in front of the camera every day during the Iraq War explaining this or that. And he had some zingers. He said something about like when no weapons of mass destruction turned up, which was the pretext for the Iraq War in the first place. Donald Rumsfeld said something like, there's the evidence, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So you can see like this over clever kind of mind at work, right? This is somebody who's really good at political manipulation and bureaucratic manipulation. And but he did say something that I think is true. He said a few things. One of the things he said is you go to war with the army you have, meaning like you can't there's no point in saying I wish that this army had these assets and not those assets. And like Iran uh is Iran. It's not just a question of what Iran has militarily. It's a question of like how Iran's system works, how Iran's politics works, the mentality, the way that Iranians perceive war. They don't do it like the Anglo-Americans. Almost nobody does. They are reluctant to get into it. They want to negotiate. They like to find ways to avoid it if they can. And on the other side, they don't really lie. They don't really I mean they lie, like everybody lies in diplomacy, like saying that you like something that you don't, or that a deal is good if it's actually not that good. Those are all diplomatic lie. Diplomacy is based on that type of lie, right? But they don't um you know do these transparent things that Trump does, like say I'm going to give it 2 weeks and then haha, I attacked you uh on day 4 of the 2 week period. Like nobody is Once you realize that somebody is so committed to that kind of deception, it ceases to be a very successful tactic, and all it does now is make it um untenable to go to a ceasefire. So at which the foreign minister of Iran said basically, we were negotiating. We don't really see what there is to negotiate now. We're gonna go back and negotiate, and then you're gonna attack us again when you feel comfortable. And there was somebody else, another Iranian official, who said that. He said, we have been approached for ceasefire talks, but they're they're going to use the time to get ready, and we don't see why we should give them time. And it's true. Like right now it's Israel that needs time, right? Israel is taking massive damage every day. Iran is taking damage every day too, but Iran was also getting bombed. The assassinations took place there's a whole covert war. I mean, all of these strikes that the Israelis did, all going back to the assassinations of Iranian scientists, to the assassination of Iranian personnel and everywhere, because the Iranians, this kind of death by a thousand cuts that the West is trying to do on Iran is facilitated through cyclical negotiations, through the International Atomic Energy Agency. The Iranians revealed that the International Atomic Energy Agency was passing information to the Israelis that the Israelis used to assassinate Iranian scientists. That's an abomination of an international institution. The United Nations is an abomination. The IAEA is a UN agency. That's an abomination. They're passing information to get people assassinated. So the Iranians don't do that stuff. And the other thing, you can like that or not, but they don't do it. They don't behave like the Israelis and the Americans do. They're very precious about their independence. So people were asking, why doesn't China help? China's probably helping. There's electronic warfare assets in the region. China hasn't explained what they're doing there whatsoever. There's all kinds of logistical help. China never stopped trading with Iran, even when the Americans told them to stop. For China, it's a matter of sovereignty. China said, we support Iran's sovereignty. Why hasn't Russia helped? Russia helped. Russia and Iran have a strategic partnership. They asked Putin this week. They said, well, what's going on with Iran? And he said, yeah, we offered them a partnership and including military partnership, and they said no. And that's not, you can say bad on Iran for saying no, but they're polite. Russia and Iran have good relations. Iran just feels Iran's position was we don't need it. We don't need it. We're not subordinating ourselves to another country. They have that pride, and they also have had bad experiences, including with Russia, with the Soviet Union. If you go back through that whole history, including of Iran's missile program, there were some issues that Iran had navigating those relationships with Pakistan, with Russia, with the Soviet Union, with China. So, their conclusion was independence is the best way. And when they help when they help regions, when they help the Iraqis fight ISIS, when they help Hezbollah fight Israel, when they help Syria fight ISIS and Israel, they took that position. The Palestinians, they took that position of we're here to help you build your capacity. We're not here to make a client out of you. And Yemen, of course, same with Yemen. And Yemen has a lot of capacities and a lot of abilities now that are Yemen's, that are not borrowed from Iran. And I did come to understand this relatively late in the war, how much Yemen actually has in terms of research and development and a military industry that Iran plays a part in, but Yemen has a history of acquiring these things too. So Iran helps in a very specific self-sufficiency building way. Iran gets help in a very self-sufficiency preserving way. Iran is quite confident about its ability to beat Israel. Iran has been preparing to fight the US and holding a lot back from their attacks on Israel in order to have resources ready to fight the Americans if need be, which apparently that time has arisen. And they are the other thing about the Iranians is they don't betray their friends and they don't betray Palestine. There's no history of them betraying Palestine, and that is why the Americans and the Israelis are going to war with them. It's not about nuclear enrichment. It's not about nuclear facilities or a nuclear weapon. It's about Iran not bending the knee, um, not following the American order, the Israeli American order to let them destroy the Palestinians, to let them destroy the countries of the region. And that's the Iran that you have. And that Iran that you have is also an Iran that invested huge amounts of their intellectual and industrial ability into missiles, missile development, air defense secondarily, and not very much into secret police, dirty tricks, the Mossad type of activities, not very much comparatively into Top Gun type dogfights in the sky. You're not going to see that. Not too much in those kinds of specialties that the Americans have. But what the Iranians do, they're among the best in the world at, and they're doing that now in this war. That's what you're seeing Iran do. Um, and the other, of course, the other attitude that the Iranians have, especially the religious elements that are in the paramount position in the state in Iran, is the the belief in martyrdom, the belief in the specific stories of Islam that have to do with martyrdom of um, the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, this battle at Karbala where they said we will never accept humiliation. They'll seek martyrdom before humiliation. And so this whole rigmarole of threatening Ayatollah Khamenei's life, like he's 86 years old. He's the leader of a religion where martyrdom is the highest thing that a person can achieve. It's it's not a like it's not a the idea of everybody just thinks that everybody in the West, they read too much fiction. They think it's like everything is 1984 by George Orwell, and there's one dictator and you kill the dictator and then the whole system, the mothership, you kill Thanos and then all the minions turn to dust. And I think the Israelis and the Americans have just they've just drunk this mothership trope where you throw the ring into the lava and then all the orcs melt. They just turn to melt. They just melt on the battlefield. And that's not what happens. Um, it's really not what happens. So the Americans have joined, and the Iranians have, and I recommend you've probably seen Marandi, Professor Marandi, all over the place. He's been making a lot of appearances. I try to catch every single little one that he does. And before the Americans joined, he was saying Israel's 1,500 kilometers away from Iran, but the American bases in the various Gulf states, whether it's Qatar or Saudi, they're much closer. And yeah, they can reach Iran from closer, but Iran can reach them from closer. And, whenever you analyze these things and you think about like, oh, the B-2 bomber can do all this devastating damage, but to do that, you also have to get into range of air defense. And the B-2 bomber is special. I don't know that anybody knows how to catch it. I'm sure the Chinese electronic warfare and the Russians, I'm sure everybody's very interested in studying that profile of the B-2 bomber and seeing whether they can actually shoot it down. But they don't they can't, they're not magic. And so we are living in a material world, and the materials that the West has are, they have huge advantages in certain technologies and not huge advantages in others. And the Israelis, what they did on June 13th in Iran and what they did in the pager attack on Hezbollah, which were the two biggest reversals, the two biggest tricks that they have played so far. And they involved fairly low technology, infiltration into the Western logistics system, and a willingness to commit atrocities against all norms and against your ability to kind of be able to predict that they would commit such atrocities. The same goes for assassinating Hassan Nasrallah. So presumably, if they go for that approach with Ayatollah Khamenei, they're going to be hoping for the mothership trope, but that's not at all what's going to happen. Now, reaching the bases is one thing. Iran has other options. People keep talking about the ability to close the Strait of Hormuz. That's, of course, something that Iran can do. I don't think we'll see, but I don't think that the Israelis or the Americans could stop them from doing that if they decide that they're going to do that. And they have, the parliament has voted that they're willing to do it, so they're kind of handing it over to the supreme leader and the National Security Council to make that call, and they'll decide to do it when they decide to do it. And this is a lot of how Iran behaves. They're on their own timeline. They don't launch all their missiles. They launch 10 missiles. They don't launch all their drones. They launch a few hundred drones. They measure, they watch, they see where they land, they see the effect they had, and then they do it again. And they're not provocable into hasty action. They are all about, dignity and not having humiliation and martyrdom. It's just not a mentality that the Western countries, that the Zionists or the Americans they can't, the the Anglos used to say that the English imperialist special talent was getting into the skin of subject peoples. But Iranians, if you understand a bit about Iranians and about Iran, and you understand a bit about Zionists and the American elite that is making this war, they are far from being able to get into the skin of the Iranians. They're very far from that. And, there are still collaborator types that would be willing to run Iran for them. The former Shah's son or whatever has made some tweets expressing his readiness. But really, this attack on June 13th, let alone yesterday's attack, has marginalized those voices a lot. It really has. So Iran now has a whole bunch of options. And speaking of Russia, I mentioned Putin earlier, but you also have Medvedev. And Medvedev is on the Russian Security Council, but Medvedev is very bombastic in terms of his public announcements. But he's part of the establishment. He's never been purged for anything that he says. So if he says these things, it's sort of like, I read it as the bombastic version of what's acceptable elite opinion in Russia. And he's basically said, I think today, that the Iranians are gonna now build a weapon, a nuclear weapon. They're gonna get rid of the NPT. It's absurd, he said. I think it was him or the Russian Security Council, the UN Security Council member for Russia. He said this is he used a great word. He said something like this is lopsided or this is absurd or something. But he was just like, Iran accepted all these inspections and Israel has nuclear weapons and isn't part of the regime and doesn't have to be. And this is completely bizarre. The way that this is running is totally bizarre. And this is like it's a total upside down world mentally. The fact that we talk about Iran, the fact that the Western elite and media are allowed to talk about Iran in terms of their nuclear program and their enrichment and whether they're deceiving the NPT and secretly trying to build a weapon. Meanwhile, Israel has hundreds of nuclear weapons that they don't have anyone inspect, they don't declare, they stole from America. The spy that stole them was in American prison for a while and then released, and now he's living in Israel, still warmongering. Um, so it's a truly upside down world, and Medvedev called it, and he said Iran's going to build a nuclear weapon, and and if Iran doesn't want to build a nuclear weapon, we'll give them one. We'll give them one. There are several countries. I assume he meant Pakistan, Russia, North Korea. He said there are several countries that can just give them nuclear weapons if that's what they want. And of course, Iran doesn't want it because of the things I told you already. They have a fatwa against it. They probably are going to get one now. I mean, it's just they at some point you have to acknowledge the world you live in and adjust even the strongest principles according to the enemies you face and the world you live in. And I imagine they're going to get a nuclear weapon or announce that they have one in not very long. We'll see if I'm wrong, but that's what I see happening fairly soon. But the deputy, I think the foreign minister, apparently, again, I don't see like super verified sources, but I've seen tweets going back and forth, and apparently the foreign minister said something like, we don't need it. We don't need a nuclear weapon, but if you want to give one to Ansar Allah in Yemen, you can go ahead and do that. So, honestly, there's no one I would trust with a nuclear weapon more than Ansar Allah. They're the only truly humanitarian intervention, you know, in decades. They they initiated a blockade and went to war to try to stop the genocide in Gaza, and they are still at war now. And now that America attacked Iran, Yemen said, we're gonna be fighting again. We're gonna be fighting with the U.S. Navy again. If they come within our reach, we're gonna get them. So there will be naval battles. And by the way, the Americans attack and the Israelis are attacking nuclear facilities freely now. They're just bombing nuclear facilities with utter freedom, without a care in the world for the future of the planet. So we're not on the brink of catastrophe. We are in a catastrophe. We're not on the brink of genocide in Gaza. We are in a genocide in Gaza. We are not on the brink of World War III. We are in World War III. And we're not on the brink of nuclear war. We are in a nuclear war. Nuclear war has begun. If you have nuclear armed states that are striking nuclear facilities from the air, they're bombing nuclear facilities from the air, you're in nuclear war. That's where we are. We are not. I would be shocked if we get out of this without nuclear poisoning and toxicity. The Iranians will now hit the Israeli nuclear facilities, which are known. They're in Dimona. There may be some others. Everybody knows them. They know where they are. Israel's a very small place. There's not a lot of places to hide things. and the Iranians are gonna use their missiles, and they're gonna hit those too. If they haven't already. I've seen unconfirmed reports that they have already. So it is on, the war is on. The Iranians are the other thing that I saw, and if you're wondering what Iran is likely to do next, I mean, I'm always at the most ease practice predicting the status quo. I get the sense today watching statements and the Iranian attack, the Iranian missile barrage today, that Iran is just going to continue hitting Israel, which, if that's what they've decided to do, as opposed to closing the Straits of Hormuz, as opposed to attacking those US bases, if that's what they've decided to do, that's very similar to what Yemen did, right? Yemen, they were launching missiles and drones at Israel, like one a day, and the Americans got mad at them and started bombing them to try to get them to stop bombing Israel. They continued to bomb Israel to the tune of one missile or drone a day, and also fought the US Navy, launching their anti-shipping ballistic missiles at the US Navy until the US Navy withdrew one ship and then another ship and another ship. And then eventually the US Navy basically declared a de facto ceasefire with Yemen. And Yemen, throughout that period, during, before, and after, continued to hit Israel the whole time. And so I imagine the Iranians might take a leaf from that book. They might just keep bombing Israel. And if they get angry at if the Americans keep bombing them and they get angry, they'll retaliate against Israel instead of, and they'll probably try to shoot down whatever the Americans fly over. They may hit US Navy assets if they get into range, but they will mainly continue to hit Israel. And that's what I did see an Iranian official say, we're fighting a very complex war. The first step is the destruction of Israel. So that could be the direction that they take this. If all of this war is to protect, if the Americans went into this to protect the Israelis and their genocide against Gaza, then there's a strategic logic to Iran focusing on Israeli targets rather than trying to attack all the American bases because they're close or because the Americans have joined the war. The Americans joined the war a long time ago by any reasonable logic. The F-35s that the Israelis have flown are American. The bombs that the Israelis are dropping are American. The intelligence that comes from satellites, the satellites are American. The Zionists, Americans are Zionists as much as Israelis are Zionists. Zionism is the belief in the colonization of Palestine by Jewish people and the destruction of the native population. And those Zionism, that by that definition, America, Germany, Canada, and Israel are all Zionist, and they're all more or less equally Zionist. So attacking that project is, if you want to put it in schoolyard terms, hitting the West where it hurts. They're hitting Israel, which is the most precious thing. And Israel's genocide is the most precious thing to the West right now. Protecting that is the most precious thing. So maybe that's what Iran will do. Or maybe tomorrow everything will change again. I don't discount the possibility that Israel may have more surprise attacks. It is worth unpacking and looking for patterns in the Israeli terrorist arsenal. I think by now we can see a few. Saying you're going to negotiate and assassinating the negotiators, saying we're going to negotiate until a month from now and attacking 2 days from now, putting a ceasefire proposal on the table, and then doing high-profile assassinations, using the ceasefire negotiations to monitor the movements of people in order to try to assassinate them. Assassination being the main goal of their mentality. The horizon of their mentality is assassinating leaders. The ability to, or the ability and interest in using civilian technologies, infiltrating civilian technologies like pagers, drones, taking years to do it. They take 8 months, a year to set up the pager attack. They took a year to set up the drone swarms and the assassinations of the Iranian military leaders that they did on the 13th of June. So really it's like, what have they been planning for a year? Can you figure that out? What have they been planning for 6 months? So that's going to come to fruition in 2 months or a year. And what are they planning? What are they hatching now? Or what are they planting now that's going to hatch, that they're going to hatch in a year from now? What are the terrorist attacks using civilian technologies to assassinate important leaders that they're trying to plan now? That's, I think, the kinds of questions that we can ask and wonder about. In the meantime, for this week, I imagine there will be 10 missiles landing in various parts of Israel every day. I imagine the Israelis will continue to launch drones and fly to the Iraq border and launch missiles, and maybe fly over over Iran and drop bombs. The Americans will be bombing Israel. I mean, we'll be bombing Iran this week. I don't think that that was a purposely weak strike or a symbolic strike or Trump's attempt to get out of the war. It was Trump's attempt to get into the war. And I think that now America's in the war, and America's going to keep bombing Iran, and Iran is going to keep pounding Israel. That's what I think you can expect this week. Iran will be pounding Israel this week, and the Americans and the Israelis together will be bombing Tehran and other parts of Iran. The genocide is still absolutely going on. It is still devastating. It looks to me like the Israelis are stepping up their massacres, their aid massacres, and they're bombing in Gaza. They're bombing Lebanon. The Syrian state is bombing its own people. They're doing suicide bombings in churches, which is not Islam. So whatever they're following there is some distortion of that, some Zionist distortion that they're following in Syria. And yeah, I mean, Iraq militias, like some of the things that Morandi said on one of the shows that I watched, he said, Iraq is thinking of taking back Kuwait. Yemen is thinking of taking back the Hijaz and parts of Saudi Arabia. So this war now, where things have gone now, what's opened up now is the possibilities of redrawing maps, the possibilities of the expulsion of the US from the whole region, a whole new security situation, a whole new system. And the way that Israel is unraveling now, where it's almost impossible to imagine how a ceasefire could happen now, after the amount of treachery, after the amount of terrorism, after the amount of lies. How could they be believed if they come to the table asking for a ceasefire? I don't understand how negotiations are supposed to proceed now. and who the honest brokers are supposed to be, and all of those kinds of questions. That whole framework is gone. The United Nations is disgraced. You guys, can you imagine? This is exactly the kind of thing that the Security Council would have met and issued a binding resolution, and both sides would have followed it. Can you imagine how crazy that sounds now? But that's happened in the past. The Security Council would meet, pass a binding resolution, and then both sides would stop. They would cease firing. And during this war, that was broken definitively with Gaza. The Security Council passed a resolution. The UN Security Council passed a resolution. The US didn't veto it. They abstained, I think. And then the Israelis just kept on genociding. And so now the United Nations is over. You know, we haven't acknowledged, we haven't held the ceremony for it, but it's over. The Security Council will not be resolving this war between Israel and Iran. And it will only be decided on the battlefield. And that means basically through, I mean, through, I don't know. I don't know I don't know what of Israel is gonna survive this, because the targets that Iran is bombing, the absence of normal life in Israel. Like, normal life is supposed to proceed in Israel regardless of who they're genociding and how much genocide they're doing on the Palestinians. And normal life is getting almost untenable in Israel now, because there's Iranian missiles that are destroying, that are really devastating in terms of their impact now. So that's what I think you can anticipate this week. I'm sorry not to have gone into details, but again, like when there's one major thing, which just happened yesterday with the Americans entering the war, and the previous week with Iran being attacked by Israel, I've got to work on that one major thing. I'll come back hopefully next week with a more detail oriented reports from the fronts and the things that you usually expect here. But tonight I just wanted to kind of go through what's happened since Trump made that call. And people talk about the fracture of Trump's coalition and MAGA fracturing. And I believe that the electoral system and the elite in America are very disciplined. And I don't think that there's much to expect in terms of fractures in that elite. Again, I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I think the whole Western elite is pretty disciplined, and they're pretty much here to make sure the Israelis can commit their genocide with impunity. That's what they're here for. That's what they want, and that's what they're going to do. So I wouldn't expect anything from the domestic US political space to come that's going to stop the war, that's going to stop the genocide, anything like that. I also don't see anything like that from the domestic Israeli space either. I think the Israelis are, as a country, also very disciplined, very united behind genocide and their own superiority, their racial ideology. So I would not expect anything to come from any of that or international law. That is why we watch the battlefield here. So hang in there, and we'll see you on the next one.